All the bits and bobs of getting into the pulpit. There's a lot always that goes into this, and I want to offer my appreciation for all the support that goes into bringing someone into the pulpit, particularly Reverend Tim and Mary Beth and Scott. It's a pleasure to hear you play. It's been a while. And my apologies for not playing with you, as it were. Not singing lately. I have been taking voice again, though, so there's hope on the horizon for that. And I discovered that as a PhD student at UVA, I can take voice lessons if I want, and they pay for it. Look at that. So yeah, I have no excuse. um, So the message I'm going to share with you today, and I will use one of my long sermon lives today. It's a little bit longer than I normally do. Um, and also it's recycled. I don't generally recycle sermons, but I felt like this community in particular needed to hear this message from 3 weeks ago because what it is based around happened in your literal backyard. Um, I will also recognize and acknowledge that some of you may not agree with my assessment of the events that happened on the UVA campus on May 4th, and that's your right. All I can say is that I was physically there and that, again, I'm a current student in the religious studies department in the PhD program. And I know and have been in communication with many of the people directly impacted. I'm in conversation with university leaders across the country who have had to respond to this moment in their own communities. And whether they are faculty or staff, they all agree that the UVA response was deeply troubling. So on May 4th, I was working on a sermon for the UU Church of the Shenandoah Valley when I started getting alerts on my phone. UVA emergency alert, police activity in the area of the Rotunda Chapel, avoid the area. This was going to be hard for me because I was at the library, which is next to the chapel. Then the alert changed. UVA emergency alert, unlawful assembly has been declared at the Rotunda Chapel area, avoid the area. And with that, I headed outside to the Rotunda Chapel area. Something I've learned in my time around protests, in and around protests, and people protesting, and government and policy, is that when someone declares something, in particular, when something is declared unlawful, there's usually someone with a weapon and the means to escalate the situation who is making or promote or provoking that declaration. I've seen it with Black Lives Matter and with people experiencing homelessness, and I've seen it and experienced it firsthand with LGBTQ activism. So stepping out of the library, it was immediately clear that things were not going down well. There were probably, I don't know, maybe 1,000 students jockeying for a position to get a clear view of the standoff occurring. And what we witnessed was a small assembly of tents and relatively small gathering of protesters with Palestinian flags being directly faced down by no fewer than 50, maybe 70 armed state police in body armor and full riot gear. That doesn't include the hundreds of backup in tactical gear who were wrangling the crowd I was part of. If it wasn't such a menacing sight, it would have been ridiculous. So yes, there were weapons, but not in the hands of the protesters. Although we've subsequently been told that umbrellas wielded by protesters are dangerous tactical weaponry, that could be why Mary Poppins thinks umbrellas are practically perfect in every way. There was chanting from students in the surrounding crowd, and there were people handing out bottles of water to flush eyes in case tear gas was deployed. At first, it didn't feel like it was going to go that direction. And then it did. The soldiers, for that's what they were, started to move forward without any concern for what or who was in their way. They literally stomped through the tents and pushed the people back with their shields and batons. They then took up a position that they held for quite a while. Eventually, an officer with a bullhorn made an announcement that I couldn't hear, but that I knew was basically reading the protesters' rights and giving them warning. This is standard procedure when the police are escalating force. And that is what they did. Shades of Kent State. On their next moves forward through the, again, small crowd, the police began spraying jets of pepper spray and using their shields as bludgeons, sometimes at point blank range. I was at enough of a distance that I was not in danger of being harmed, but I was close enough to get a view of what was actually happening. Little did I know at that moment, a friend of mine was one of the first people who was taken to the ground by force, and his partner was the one receiving pepper spray to their face. I don't need to go on describing this. The people I know who were arrested were all able to be released before midnight. They're healing from their physical and emotional wounds. There are charges pending. They were shaken and disheartened, but not daunted. However, I was fed up. I wrote a blog post about it and posted it shortly after I left the scene that day. I'm not fed up with some non-specific, unidentifiable force of supremacy. This situation is not just rhetoric for me. This situation to me is about leadership. More specifically, a failure of leadership at UVA. I end the blog post like this. UVA administration failed miserably today. My dissertation is starting to take shape. The more I study, the more my dissertation is emerging to be about violence, histories and legacies of violence. Today was a good reminder that part of that study needs to include a description of how leadership can not only be violence in itself, but how the absence of leadership becomes violence when it is passed off by cowards as policy. Shame on you, UVA. I will not forget these images. I cannot forgive you this. I sent this blog post to President Ryan, Provost Balcom, the Dean of Graduate Arts and Sciences, as well as the Deans of Student Life, who I know personally. At the time, I couldn't be sure if they would read it. Frankly, I didn't care if they did. What was clear to me was that UVA has a drastically different ethic of leadership than I do. And that means that as a student and as a minister, I need to make choices. Following these events, I was able to support people by briefly being in the courtroom, by helping the graduate students of religious studies issue a statement, and by listening to people, students and faculty, who have been impacted by the event. My pastoral impulse, which is both personal and professional, had no choice but to engage. But I also had to explore my own heart and mind. I had to ask myself seriously if I could stay at an institution that would do this, have this kind of response. Part of my question now is motivated by having nightmares about what I saw. Part of asking if I can stay also comes from realizing that I haven't been able to return to campus since then because it's just too upsetting. I don't feel as if the campus, which is also haunted by the many people who were enslaved there, is a place where I can ever be welcome. I also realized that for some reason, what I witnessed not half a mile from where we are today blanked out my prior experiences with the police, some of which are horrible. And I can't remember my previous police interactions, but I know they are there. Something, for whatever reason, snapped. This feels like more than an isolated set of events. By my estimation, we are in a time that history will recognize as a global leadership vacuum. What seems to have taken the place of leadership is a combination of social media appeal and sensationalism. Everyone wants hits and clicks, and no one is willing to solve real problems. Even President Biden has gotten this wildly wrong. While I can appreciate someone like him who has experienced unthinkable personal tragedy, the trajectory of his professional life says that in 60 years, he hasn't been anywhere near a phalanx of armed soldiers heading toward him with the intent to neutralize him. There are members of Congress who know exactly what I'm talking about. He and all of our candidates for president are solidly out of touch. When I first started writing this message on May 4th, I wanted to say something different about leadership. I wanted to talk about how too often we conflate leadership with brand appeal and charisma. That is the real poison of Donald Trump. What I had in mind was actually quite humorous, but it got dark pretty quickly because I started to think that sadly, it is sometimes the poison of UU ministers as well. UU ministry training doesn't include any deep or serious scholarly dive into theories of leadership, and the only practices of leadership training many UU ministers get is in an internship where you are limited by the way supervising ministers want to keep interns reined in. The result is that many of my colleagues, definitely not Reverend Tim, prioritize trying to be appealing people with dynamic speaking styles and great presence and leave it at that. But that's not leadership. That's a fashion show. Leadership is first recognizing that you are not the only one in charge. There must be desire and willingness to be led. Leadership requires being part of a system that wants to go in some kind of direction. The best leader then may not necessarily be on the horse out front screaming charge. They may actually be hanging back, helping the people who have the real on the ground skills to sustain the effort. The best leader may be the one who can recognize danger ahead of others. The best leader may be able to recognize the common idea that competing factions can't see because they're too passionately engaged. Leadership is perspective. It is not a pretty stole or the right haircut or a great vocabulary. Leadership, particularly in ministry, is being able to ask impossibly hard questions or state impossibly hard truths and keep people in the conversation long enough so that they can understand and make choices. Leadership wants you to succeed and does not necessarily care about its own success. That is not to say leadership is selfless or martyrdom. Rather, leadership is mostly about being fully awake. It is every fiber of awareness and sensitivity turned on, including the ones that let the leader know they are on the wrong path or that they've hurt someone. Leadership is intentional and demonstrable humility and patience. For me, personally, this is how UVA leadership failed. As I mentioned, I shared my blog with President Ryan. He did eventually write back to me. In his response to my blog, he directed me to the recording of the town hall that was held and where they outlined the decision-making process that I still question. His response did what I suppose it was intended to do. It filled the response void with the narrative that has been agreed upon to keep the institution safe. This is a common public relations triage tactic. As such, I responded with my own public relations tactic of completely ignoring this rhetoric and offering my own direction. I wrote to him, I said, "Thank you, Jim." Now, he addressed himself in his reply to me as Jim, and though I signed my message to him as Reverend Adam Lawrence Dyer, one of the few times I do that kind of thing, he addressed me back by my first name only, which, assuming best intentions, I will take as an effort to be less formal and more human. I said, "Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your taking time to reply. My only other question is if you would be willing to meet with an interfaith group of leaders to discuss future response options. I ask, having previously been part of community and university thinking groups about crisis response at Harvard and Cambridge. Experienced chaplains and pastoral leaders like myself who have been engaged with multiple populations may have insight into de-escalation approaches that haven't been considered in a strictly traditional police/policy compliance-based model. Happy to discuss with you or anyone in leadership who is open to creative solutions." Again, thank you for your direct reply in this busy and challenging time. It means a lot to me as a professional and as a student. Adam. So I've been prattling on about leadership here, and basically, I'm still decompressing in public from what I experienced. I appreciate your willingness to listen and to go down this road with me. It is a comfort. May 4th was hard. The last few years have been hard. Coming to Charlottesville after 2017 was hard, knowing that the Unite the Right rally happened here. Shortly after starting my program in the fall of 2022, as you all most heartfelt remember, there was a shooting on campus that took the lives of 3 students and destroyed the life of the shooter, who was close with students I knew. Now this. UVA for me feels like an emotional mistake. The jury is not out yet, so I will keep on for now. But as someone who is comfortable making life and death decisions for others, choosing to save my sanity and my integrity by changing my relationship with UVA is something I am fully capable of. But I don't want to leave you with such a cheery message as that. My point in talking about leadership today is to encourage you to think more deeply about how each of you is part of the leadership of your communities. Again, leadership is not sitting astride a massive horse with a sword. Leadership is intention. This is particularly important for you as a church. Through everything you have experienced and weathered as a community, you've demonstrated that you have the most important intention that any community can have, the intention to survive. Look around this room, seriously, look at each other, have a look at each other right now. Didn't know they were here today, did you? Think about how you have relied on one another, gotten to know each other, trusted each other. That is a leadership and a cohesion that no minister can provide for you. All the person in the pulpit can do, whether that is me or Reverend Leo or Reverend Tim or someone else, is remind you now and again to recognize that shared bond, to be grateful for it, and to protect it with everything you've got. Because when you're facing a budget shortfall or staffing changes, or if you're on the street facing a row of soldiers who are ready to beat you down for what you believe in, and whether that is metaphorical or, God forbid, literal, you'll know you've got each other's backs. Lead on, and may it be so.